the sleepy village of Chipping Norton, a locked library hides a deadly secret. When reclusive Harold Grayson is found dead, his door bolted from within, the coroner calls it a heart attack, but Miss Jane Marple, with her keen eye and quiet wisdom, suspects murder. A cryptic letter from Buenos Aires, a burned fragment in the ashes, a niece's hidden visit, and a housekeeper's buried grudge unravel a web of betrayal tied to a scandalous past. As whispers of poison and deceit surface, Miss Marple pieces together a chilling truth. In the silence of a locked room, someone ensured Grayson's secrets would die with him. Will she unmask the killer before the village's calm hides another crime? Chapter 1. The Quiet of Chipping Norton. The village of Chipping Norton lay cradled in the soft folds of the English countryside. Its stone cottages and winding lanes bathed in the pale light of an early summer morning. Honeysuckle clung to garden walls, and the distant bleat of sheep carried on the breeze, mingling with the chime of the church clock striking 9. It was a place where time seemed to pause, where neighbours exchanged pleasantries over low hedges, and every face was known, or so the villagers liked to believe. Yet beneath this tranquil surface, secrets stirred, as they always did in such quiet places, waiting for a discerning eye to uncover them. Miss Jane Marple, a delicate figure with snow-white hair and a gentle demeanour, had arrived in Chipping Norton to spend a few weeks with her nephew, Raymond West. Raymond, a writer of some repute, had taken a cottage on the village green to escape the clamour of London and work on his latest novel. The cottage, with its thatched roof and diamond-pane windows, suited Miss Marple perfectly. She sat now in the small sitting room, her knitting needles moving rhythmically as she worked on a pale pink shawl, her sharp blue eyes fixed on the world beyond the window. The village green bustled quietly. A boy wheeled a bicycle, a woman carried a basket of bread from the bakery, and old Mr. Phipps, the butcher, swept the step of his shop with vigorous disapproval of the modern world. Raymond, lounging in an armchair with a notebook, glanced at his aunt. "Peaceful, isn't it, Aunt Jane? Not a whiff of intrigue to disturb your knitting." Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. "Peaceful places, Raymond, are often the most deceptive. People here have the time to brood, you see, and brooding leads to all sorts of mischief." Before Raymond could reply, the door opened, and Clara, the young housemaid, entered with a tray of tea things. Her cheeks were flushed with the excitement of news, her eyes bright with something to tell. "Oh, Miss Sir, have you heard?" she said, setting the tray on the table. "It's Mr. Grayson, up at Willow Grange. Found dead this morning, he was, in his library. Door locked tight, they say, and not a soul with him." Raymond sat up, his writer's curiosity piqued. "Grayson? That old hermit at the manor. What happened?" "They're saying it was his heart," Clara replied, arranging the cups with a clatter. Dr. Haydock was called at dawn. Mrs. Bates, his housekeeper, found him when she came in. Slumped over his desk, poor man, and the room locked from the inside. Ever so strange, isn't it? Miss Marple's needles paused just for a moment. "Locked from the inside," she murmured, as if to herself. "How very interesting. And the windows, Clara? Were they locked too?" Clara nodded eagerly. "Oh, yes, miss. Bolted shut," Mrs. Bates said. "No one could have got in or out. Gives me the shivers, it does." "Thank you, Clara," Miss Marple said, her voice mild but her mind already turning over the details. As the maid left, Raymond chuckled. "You're not going to turn this into one of your mysteries, are you, Aunt Jane? Man has a heart attack, dies alone, simple enough." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression serene. "Simple, perhaps, but a locked room, Raymond, is rarely as simple as it seems. In my experience, people lock doors for a reason, and it's seldom a good one." She returned to her knitting, but her thoughts were far from the soft wool in her hands. She knew little of Harold Grayson, yet the village had already begun to weave a tapestry of whispers about him. A retired solicitor, widowed, solitary, living in the shadow of Willow Grange's high walls. He was a man who kept his own counsel, and in a village like Chipping Norton, such reticence was as good as a confession of something to hide. Miss Marple recalled a similar case in her own village years ago, where a locked door had concealed not just a death, but a betrayal. She wondered what secrets Mr. Grayson's library held, and whether the silence of that room was as innocent as it appeared. Chapter 2. The Man Who Kept to Himself. The sun hung low over Chipping Norton, casting long shadows across the village green, as Miss Jane Marple walked arm in arm with her nephew, Raymond West, along the high street. The air was warm with the scent of blooming roses, and the hum of bees mingled with the soft chatter of villagers going about their errands. To the casual observer, the scene was one of idyllic calm, but Miss Marple's keen eyes missed nothing. The furtive glance of a shopkeeper, the hushed tone of a conversation that ceased as they passed. She knew that villages, for all their outward simplicity, were intricate webs of secrets, and the death of Harold Grayson had set that web trembling. Raymond, ever the urbanite, found the village's fascination with the event amusing. "They're all agog over Grayson's death," he remarked, nodding toward a cluster of women outside the bakery, their heads bent close. "You'd think a locked room makes it a penny dreadful mystery." Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. "A village thrives on its stories, Raymond, and Mr. Grayson, I suspect, has given them a tale worth telling." Her tone was light, but her mind was already sifting through the fragments of gossip she had gathered since morning. Harold Grayson, the reclusive occupant of Willow Grange, was a puzzle, and Miss Marple had always been fond of puzzles. They paused at the greengrocer's, where Mrs. Tuttle, a stout woman with a penchant for bright scarves, was arranging apples in a wicker basket. "Terrible business about Mr. Grayson," she said, unprompted, as she handed Raymond a bag of plums. "Not that I knew him well, mind. Kept to himself, he did, up at that gloomy manor. Never saw him but at church, and even then, he'd slip out before the final hymn." "Did he now?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle, inviting confidence. "A solitary sort, then?" "Oh, aye," Mrs. Tuttle replied, lowering her voice. "Lived alone since his wife passed, poor soul. Only Mrs. Bates, that sharp-tongued housekeeper, and his niece, Miss Eleanor, ever went near the place. And the postman, of course, on account of all those letters." "Letters?" Miss Marple's eyes brightened behind her spectacles. "He was a great correspondent, I take it?" Mrs. Tuttle leaned closer, her scarf fluttering. "So Mr. Phipps says. He delivers the post, you know. Said Mr. Grayson got letters regular, some from abroad. One came just last week, with a queer stamp. South America, Mr. Phipps thought, though he couldn't be sure." Raymond, growing impatient, shifted his weight. "Probably just business," he said. "He was a solicitor, wasn't he?" "Retired," Mrs. Tuttle corrected, with a knowing nod. and not a soul in Chipping Norton knew what he did with his days, locked away in that library of his. Writing letters, reading books, queer ones too, full of foreign words, or so Mrs. Bates let slip. Miss Marple thanked her and moved on, her mind turning over this new information. Foreign letters, a solitary man, a locked library. The pieces were small, but they were beginning to form a pattern. She thought of Mr. Elwood, a retired chemist from her own village who had once received mysterious packages from abroad, only for it to emerge that he was entangled in a smuggling scheme. People, she reflected, often hid their true selves behind closed doors, and Harold Grayson seemed no exception. As they neared the church, its ancient stone tower rising against the evening sky, Miss Marple slowed her pace. "Let us sit a moment, Raymond," she said, gesturing to a bench beneath a yew tree. The churchyard was quiet, save for the rustle of leaves and the distant clatter of a cart. She adjusted her shawl, her knitting bag resting beside her, and gazed thoughtfully at the gravestones. "Mr. Grayson, I understand, attended services here." Raymond nodded, humouring her. "So Clara said. Always in the back pew, never speaking to anyone. Why, Aunt Jane, are you going to solve his death from the church register?" She chuckled softly. "Not quite, my dear, but churches, like villages, see more than they tell. A man who sits alone in a back pew is often hiding from something, or someone." Her thoughts were interrupted by the approach of Mr. Clement, the vicar, a kindly man with a stoop and a perpetually worried expression. He greeted them warmly, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "A sad day for Chipping Norton," he said, shaking his head. "Poor Mr. Grayson. Such a shock to go so suddenly." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her tone sympathetic. "Did you know him well, Mr. Clement?" The vicar hesitated, his fingers toying with his spectacles. "Not well, I'm afraid. He was a private man, rarely spoke beyond a nod or a word, came to services most Sundays, but he kept his distance. His wife's death, you see, 5 years ago it was, seemed to close him off entirely." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly as she resumed her knitting. "A great loss, no doubt. And he had no other family, save his niece?" "Miss Eleanor, yes," Mr. Clement said. "She visited now and then, though not often. A dutiful girl, I thought, but there was a strain between them. I once overheard her speaking sharply to him outside the church. Something about money, I believe." Raymond raised an eyebrow. "Money, that's a motive, if you're looking for one, Aunt Jane." Miss Marple's smile was serene. "Motive is a dangerous word, Raymond. It assumes too much before the facts are clear." But her mind was already at work. A niece, a solitary uncle, a hint of financial discord. These were threads she had seen before, in cases where greed or resentment simmered beneath a family's surface. She recalled a young woman in her own village who had quarrelled with her father over an inheritance, only for a tragic accident to reveal a darker truth. As they rose to return to the cottage, Miss Marple cast a final glance at the church. The evening light caught the stained glass windows, casting flecks of colour across the path. She thought of Grayson, sitting alone in his pew, his life a closed book to those around him. Yet books, she knew, could be opened, and their pages often held surprises. Back at the cottage, over a simple supper of cold ham and salad, Raymond regaled her with his latest literary theories, but Miss Marple's attention wandered. She was thinking of the foreign letter, the locked library, and the man who had lived so quietly yet died so mysteriously. "People are careless," she murmured, almost to herself as she cleared the plates. "They think solitude protects them, but it only makes their secrets louder." Raymond looked up, puzzled. "What's that, Aunt Jane?" She smiled, her eyes bright with purpose. "Nothing, my dear. Just an old woman's fancy." But as she retired to her room, her knitting bag in hand, she knew that Harold Grayson's solitude had not been as complete as he believed. Someone, somewhere, had known his secrets, and one of them, she suspected, had been in that locked room with him. Chapter 3. The Locked Library. The village hall of Chipping Norton, a sturdy brick building with a sagging roof, was unaccustomed to such a throng. On the morning of Harold Grayson's inquest, its wooden benches were filled with villagers, their faces a mixture of curiosity and solemnity, as if the proceedings were both a duty and a spectacle. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood and damp wool, for a light rain had begun to fall outside, tapping against the tall windows. Miss Jane Marple sat near the back, her small figure almost lost among the crowd, her hands folded neatly over her knitting bag. To the untrained eye, she was merely an elderly spinster, there out of neighbourly concern, but her sharp gaze missed nothing. The nervous fidgeting of Mrs. Bates, the housekeeper, the pale composure of Eleanor Grayson, and the way Dr. Haydock, the village physician, avoided meeting anyone's eyes. Raymond West, seated beside her, shifted impatiently. "This is all rather formal for a heart attack, isn't it?" he whispered. "They'll confirm the obvious and be done with it." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. "Formalities, Raymond, are often where the truth slips out. People reveal themselves when they think they're safe." Her voice was soft, but her eyes were alert, scanning the room as the coroner, a dour man named Mr. Pritchard, called the inquest to order. The facts as presented were straightforward. Harold Grayson had been found dead at his desk in the library of Willow Grange, discovered by Mrs. Bates at 7 o'clock the previous morning. The door was locked from the inside, the key found in Grayson's pocket, and the windows were bolted. Dr. Haydock testified that the cause of death was heart failure, likely brought on by natural causes, as there were no signs of violence or poisoning. Mr. Grayson was not a young man, the doctor said, his voice steady but his fingers gripping his notes a little too tightly. His heart was weak, and such things can happen suddenly. Mrs. Bates, a gaunt woman with a face like a closed fist, took the stand next. Her testimony was clipped, almost rehearsed. She had left Willow Grange at 6 the previous evening, locking the front door behind her, as was her custom. Mr. Grayson had been alive, working at his desk, and had given no indication of illness. "He was always in that library," she said, her tone edged with resentment. "Never wanted disturbing after I brought his tea." Miss Marple's knitting needles, resting in her lap, gave a faint click. Tea, she thought. Such a small detail, yet so often significant. She recalled a case in her own village, where a cup of tea had carried more than sugar and milk. Her eyes drifted to Eleanor Grayson, seated in the front row, her dark hair neatly pinned, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The young woman's face was a mask of grief, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her fingers. The way her gaze flickered when Mrs. Bates mentioned the library. Eleanor was called next, her voice low but clear. "I hadn't seen my uncle in 3 weeks," she said. I live in London, and my visits were infrequent. He preferred his solitude. When asked about his health or habits, she shook her head. He never spoke of such things. He was private. The coroner nodded, satisfied, and soon delivered his verdict: death by natural causes. The villagers murmured, some relieved, others disappointed by the lack of drama. As the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple remained seated, her mind turning over the testimony. A locked room, a key in a pocket, a man alone. Too neat, she thought, like a puzzle with one piece forced into place. "Shall we go, Aunt Jane?" Raymond asked, offering his arm. "Or are you plotting a novel of your own?" She smiled faintly. "Not a novel, Raymond, but a visit. I should like to see Willow Grange for myself, if you'll indulge an old woman's curiosity." Raymond, accustomed to his aunt's whims, agreed, and by mid-afternoon they were walking up the gravel drive to Willow Grange. The manor loomed against the grey sky, its stone facade weathered and half smothered in ivy. The housekeeper, Mrs. Bates, admitted them reluctantly, her eyes narrowing as if she suspected their motives. "The police have been and gone," she said brusquely. "Nothing to see here." "Nevertheless," Miss Marple replied, her voice mild but firm, "I should like to pay my respects to the place where poor Mr. Grayson spent his final hours." The library was a cavernous room, its walls lined with bookshelves that reached the ceiling, their spines faded and uninviting. A heavy oak desk dominated the space, its surface cluttered with papers, an inkstand, and a single fountain pen. An armchair sat by a cold hearth, and the windows, tall and narrow, were indeed bolted shut. Miss Marple moved slowly, her eyes taking in every detail. The worn rug, the faint smell of tobacco, the single teacup on a side table, its saucer slightly askew. Raymond, trailing behind, sighed. "It's just a room, Aunt Jane. Gloomy, but hardly sinister." Miss Marple did not reply immediately. She approached the desk, her gloved fingers brushing the edge of a sheet of paper. It was a half-finished letter, the ink still dark, addressed to a Signor Alvarez. The words were formal, almost urgent. "The matter must be concluded. I can delay no longer. The terms are as we discussed." She read it silently, her expression unchanging, but her mind raced. Alvarez, a foreign name, perhaps connected to the letter from South America Mrs. Tuttle had mentioned. And the tone suggested obligation, perhaps fear. "Look here, Raymond," she said, pointing to the letter. "A man does not write such words lightly. This was no idle correspondence." Raymond peered over her shoulder, his shy skepticism wavering. "Business, perhaps. An old debt. Perhaps," Miss Marple said, but her tone suggested otherwise. She moved to the window, testing the bolt. It was stiff but intact, no signs of tampering. The door, too, was solid, its lock heavy and old-fashioned. She recalled a case in her village where a locked door had been no barrier to murder. The key manipulated after the fact. "Locks," she murmured, "are only as secure as the hands that turn them." Mrs. Bates, hovering in the doorway, cleared her throat. "If you're done, miss, I've work to do." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "You've been most kind." But as they left the manor, she cast a final glance at the library, her thoughts lingering on the teacup, the letter, and the silence that seemed to cling to the room. "A locked door," she said softly to Raymond, "is like a lie. It invites belief, but it begs to be questioned." Raymond laughed, shaking his head. "You're incorrigible, Aunt Jane. Next, you'll have us digging up the garden for clues." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Not the garden, Raymond, not yet." But as they walked back to the cottage, the rain now a steady drizzle, she was already piecing together the fragments of Harold Grayson's life and death. A letter, a cup of tea, a niece who claimed distance, a housekeeper who locked doors. The truth, she knew, lay not in the locked room, but in the lives that had crossed its threshold. Chapter 4. The Shadow of the Past. The afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains of the vicarage, casting delicate patterns on the worn carpet where Miss Jane Marple sat, her knitting needles moving with their usual quiet rhythm. The vicarage, a modest house beside the church, was a hub of village life, and Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, was a woman who prided herself on knowing the pulse of Chipping Norton. Her hospitality was warm, if slightly flustered. As she poured tea from a chipped porcelain pot, her chatter filling the room with the comfortable hum of local gossip. Miss Marple, invited for afternoon tea under the guise of discussing the church flower rota, listened with polite attention, her sharp mind sifting through the words for hidden gems. Raymond West had declined to join, citing a need to work on his novel, though Miss Marple suspected he simply found the vicarage's genteel atmosphere stifling. She did not mind. Solitude suited her observations, and Mrs. Clement was proving a most obliging source. The conversation had turned inevitably to Harold Grayson's death, and Mrs. Clement's eyes gleamed with the excitement of shared confidences. "Such a dreadful thing," she said, passing a plate of scones. "To think of poor Mr. Grayson, all alone in that great house, and then to go so suddenly. Though, if I may say, he was never one to invite company. Not like his wife, God rest her soul. She was a lively one, always hosting teas and garden parties before she fell ill." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle sympathy. "A great change for him, then, after her passing. Did he ever speak of her, Mrs. Clement?" The vicar's wife shook her head, her curls bobbing. "Not a word. Closed up like an oyster he did, after she died. Moved here from London, you know, and kept to himself. Some said it was grief, but—" She paused, lowering her voice, as if the walls might overhear. "There were whispers, Miss Marple, about his time in London. A scandal, years ago, before my husband and I came to Chipping Norton. Something to do with his work as a solicitor." Miss Marple's needles paused, just for a moment. "A scandal? How intriguing! Do tell if it's not too indelicate." Mrs. Clement needed little encouragement. "It was an investment scheme, or so I've heard. Grayson handled the legal side for a company that promised grand returns, railways or some such, abroad. People put in their savings, but it all collapsed. Money vanished, and there were accusations of fraud. He was never charged, mind you, but folks said he left London to escape the talk. Some even claimed he'd made enemies, people who lost everything and blamed him." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning over this new thread. A scandal, enemies, a man who fled to the quiet of Chipping Norton. Yet even here, it seemed, he had not found peace. She thought of the letter on Grayson's desk, addressed to Senor Alvarez, with its urgent tone of debts and deadlines. Could it be tied to that old trouble? She recalled a case in her own village, where a retired banker had been hounded by a former client, the past erupting into the present with fatal consequences. "The past," she said softly, almost to herself, "has a way of lingering. like a shadow you cannot outrun. Mrs. Clement, mistaking her meaning, nodded vigorously. "Oh, indeed, and Willow Grange is such a gloomy place. All those dark rooms and creaking floors. I always thought it suited Mr. Grayson, shutting himself away like that. Though his niece, Eleanor, tried to draw him out. She'd come down from London, but he wasn't one for family warmth, from what I saw." "Miss Grayson seems a dutiful sort," Miss Marple remarked, her tone carefully neutral. "Did she visit often?" "Every few weeks," Mrs. Clement replied, buttering a scone. But there was a coolness between them, I thought. Once, after church, I saw them talking by the gate, and she seemed quite upset. Something about papers or money, though I couldn't catch it all. She left in a huff, and he looked as if he'd bitten a lemon. Miss Marple's eyes brightened behind her spectacles. A quarrel, perhaps over inheritance, or those mysterious letters. She filed the detail away, her thoughts returning to the library at Willow Grange, the locked door, the teacup, the half-written letter. "And Mr. Grayson's housekeeper, Mrs. Bates," she said, steering the conversation. "She must have known him better than most. A loyal servant, I presume." Mrs. Clement sniffed. "Loyal, perhaps, but not a cheerful one. She's been with him since he came to Chipping Norton, but she's a sour creature, always grumbling. I've heard her complain about his habits, staying up late, burning papers in the library fire, as if he had secrets to hide." "Burning papers?" Miss Marple's voice was soft, but her interest was sharp. "How curious. Did she say what sort of papers?" Mrs. Clement shook her head. "Nothing specific, but she made it sound like a regular thing. I suppose old legal documents, perhaps? Though why burn them? I can't imagine." Miss Marple could imagine several reasons, none of them innocent. She thanked Mrs. Clement for the tea and took her leave, stepping out into the soft drizzle that had returned to Chipping Norton. The village seemed to close in around her, its cottages and hedgerows hiding more than they revealed. As she walked back to Raymond's cottage, her umbrella tilted against the rain, she pondered the emerging picture of Harold Grayson, a man shadowed by a tainted past, bound by debts or promises to a mysterious Senor Alvarez, and surrounded by a housekeeper who burned papers and a niece who quarrelled with him. That evening, over a simple supper, Raymond teased her about her sleuthing. "You're building a castle out of gossip, Aunt Jane. Next, you'll have Grayson as a master criminal, hiding from assassins in his library." Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking as she worked on her shawl. "Not a master criminal, Raymond, but a man with a burden. And burdens, you know, have a way of attracting trouble." She thought of the foreign letter Mrs. Tuttle had mentioned, postmarked from Buenos Aires. A typed letter, unusual for Grayson's habits, suggesting caution or concealment. Could it be a demand from an old associate, perhaps tied to that long-ago scandal? Or something more personal, a grudge nurtured across years and continents? As she retired to her room, the village clock striking 9. Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting resting in her lap. The rain had stopped, and the night was still, but she felt the stir of something darker beneath Chipping Norton's calm. Harold Grayson had come here to escape, but escape, she knew, was rarely so simple. The shadow of his past had followed him, and in the silence of his locked library, it had found him at last. Chapter 5. The Niece's Secret. The morning mist hung low over Chipping Norton, cloaking the village in a soft grey veil that seemed to hush its usual chatter. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the damp, made her way to the post office, her sensible shoes clicking on the wet cobblestones. The post office was a small, cluttered shop, its counter piled with parcels, and its walls adorned with faded notices. Mrs. Lavender, the postmistress, was a woman of sharp eyes and sharper tongue, known for her ability to recall every letter that passed through her hands. Miss Marple, under the pretense of mailing a parcel for Raymond, hoped to glean more about the mysterious letter from Buenos Aires that had stirred her curiosity. "Good morning, Mrs. Lavender," Miss Marple said, her voice warm as she placed a small package on the counter. "Such a damp day, but I suppose it suits the mood after poor Mr. Grayson's passing." Mrs. Lavender nodded, her fingers deftly sorting envelopes. "A sad business indeed. The village hasn't stopped talking about it. Locked in his library, they say, like something out of a storybook." "Quite so," Miss Marple agreed, her eyes bright with interest. "I heard he was a great letter writer. You must have handled many of his correspondences." "Oh, aye," Mrs. Lavender replied, warming to the topic. "He sent letters regular, mostly to London, but that one from abroad last week was odd. Buenos Aires it was, typed, not handwritten, which wasn't his way. I noticed it specially, as it had a bright red stamp with some foreign bird on it." Miss Marple's needles tucked in her bag seemed to itch for movement. A typed letter, she thought, was deliberate, meant to obscure the sender's hand. "Did he receive many such letters?" she asked, her tone casual. "Not many, but enough to notice," Mrs. Lavender said. "One or two others over the years. Same sort of stamp. He'd always collect them himself, never sent Mrs. Bates, and he'd look right uneasy about it." Thanking her, Miss Marple left the post office, her mind weaving new threads into the tapestry of Harold Grayson's life. A typed letter from Buenos Aires, a man uneasy about its arrival. Small details, but to Miss Marple they were like the misplaced stitches in a knitting pattern, hinting at a larger flaw. She thought of a case in her own village, where a single letter had unravelled a web of deceit, its contents a spark to long-buried resentments. That afternoon, Eleanor Grayson arrived in Chipping Norton to arrange her uncle's funeral. Miss Marple, invited to Willow Grange by a neighbourly Mrs. Clement, seized the chance to observe the young woman. Eleanor was in her early 30s, with a poised elegance that spoke of city life, her dark hair swept into a neat chignon, her tailored coat immaculate despite the journey. They met in the Manor's drawing room, a chilly space with heavy drapes and faded portraits. Eleanor sat stiffly, her silk handkerchief twisted in her hands, her eyes shadowed with fatigue or something deeper. "My condolences, Miss Grayson," Miss Marple said, her voice soft as she settled into a chair. "It must be a great shock, losing your uncle so suddenly." Eleanor nodded, her lips tight. "Yes, it was. Unexpected. He was not an old man, but he lived so quietly here. I never thought—" She broke off, her fingers tightening on the handkerchief. Miss Marple's gaze was gentle but piercing. "You visited him here, I understand. It must have been a comfort to him, having family near." "Not often," Eleanor said quickly, her eyes flicking to the side. "I live in London, and my work keeps me busy. Uncle Harold preferred his own company. We weren't close." The hesitation in her voice was slight, but Miss Marple caught it, like a faint discord in a familiar tune. She recalled Mrs. Clement's mention of a quarrel by the church gate. Sharp words about money or papers. He must have valued your visits, though, she pressed gently. A man so solitary, with only his housekeeper for company. Eleanor's smile was thin. Mrs. Bates managed his affairs well enough. He didn't need me meddling. She rose, as if to end the conversation, but Miss Marple's next question held her. Did he ever speak of his business, perhaps old matters from his time in London? I understand he had a complicated past. Eleanor's face paled, her hand pausing on the arm of her chair. No, he never spoke of it. That was all long ago. He left it behind when he came here. Her voice was sharp, almost defensive, and Miss Marple noted the way her eyes avoided contact, darting to the window as if seeking escape. As they parted, Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on Eleanor's unease. A dutiful niece, yet distant. A woman who claimed ignorance, yet seemed to guard her words. Later that evening, as Miss Marple sat knitting by the fire in Raymond's cottage, Clara, the housemaid, brought a fresh piece of gossip that tightened the pattern. I wasn't going to say, miss, Clara whispered, glancing at the door, but I saw Miss Eleanor at Willow Grange the night before Mr. Grayson died. In the garden she was by the library window, looking all furtive-like. I was coming back from the village, and she didn't see me, but she was there, waiting for something, I'd swear. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Waiting, you say? How very curious. Did you see anyone else? Clara shook her head. No, miss, but it was dark and I didn't linger. Thought it odd, though, her saying she hadn't been here in weeks. Raymond, overhearing, laughed from his armchair. Aunt Jane, you're collecting conspiracies like postage stamps. Maybe she just wanted a quiet word with her uncle. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, her smile serene, but her mind was far from serene. Eleanor's lie was a crack in the facade, like a dropped stitch that threatened to unravel the whole. She thought of the typed letter, the locked library, the scandal in Grayson's past. Had Eleanor been drawn into it, knowingly or not? Was she protecting her uncle, or herself? As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the library window, bolted shut according to Mrs. Bates, yet a place where Eleanor had lingered. Windows, like doors, could be deceptive, their bolts a matter of timing rather than truth. She recalled a case in her village where a window had been the key to a crime, its latch manipulated to conceal a killer's exit. People lie for so many reasons, she murmured, her needles moving steadily. But the truth, Raymond, is like a shadow. It follows, no matter how fast you run. Raymond yawned, dismissing her words as fancy, but Miss Marple's eyes gleamed in the firelight. Eleanor Grayson's secret, whatever it was, had brought her to Willow Grange that night. And in Chipping Norton's quiet, where secrets whispered louder than words, Miss Marple knew she was one step closer to the truth. Chapter 6. The Clue in the Ashes. The morning sun struggled through the heavy clouds over Chipping Norton, casting a muted light on the village's cobblestone streets. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a woolen shawl against the autumn chill, walked with Raymond West toward Willow Grange, her steps deliberate despite her frail appearance. The manor's grim silhouette loomed ahead, its ivy-clad walls seeming to guard their secrets with a silent defiance. Miss Marple had persuaded Raymond for another visit, her curiosity sharpened by Eleanor Grayson's lie and the tantalizing threads of Harold Grayson's past. A second look, Raymond, she had said over breakfast, often reveals what the first glance misses. Raymond, ever indulgent of his aunt's whims, sighed as they approached the manor's iron gates. "You're chasing ghosts, Aunt Jane. The police have been through the place, and the inquest settled it. Heart attack, locked room, case closed." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Cases, my dear, are never closed until the truth is satisfied. And truth, like a good knitting pattern, requires every stitch to be accounted for." Her tone was light, but her mind was fixed on the library. The locked door, the teacup, the letter to Senor Alvarez. Each detail was a piece of a puzzle, and she sensed one piece was still hidden, waiting to be found. Mrs. Bates, the housekeeper, greeted them at the door with her usual scowl, her apron crisp, but her manner bristling. "Back again, are you?" she said, her voice sharp as she led them inside. "The police took what they needed. There's nothing more to see." "Only a moment, Mrs. Bates," Miss Marple replied, her voice soothing as honey. "I find old houses so fascinating, and poor Mr. Grayson's library must hold such stories." Her words were disarming, but her gaze was keen, noting the housekeeper's stiff posture, the way her hands twisted in her apron. The library was as they had left it. A cavern of dark wood and dusty tomes, the air heavy with the scent of old leather and wax. The oak desk stood sentinel, its surface still cluttered with papers, the half-finished letter to Senor Alvarez untouched. Miss Marple moved slowly, her eyes sweeping the room, lingering on the bolted windows, the armchair, the cold hearth. It was the hearth that drew her now. Its grate filled with a pile of ashes she had noticed on her last visit, but not yet examined. The police, it seemed, had overlooked it, their focus on the body and the locked door. But Miss Marple knew that small things, ashes, teacups, lies, often held the key to greater truths. She knelt by the hearth, her movements careful despite her age, and sifted through the ashes with a gloved finger. Raymond watched, half amused, half exasperated. "Aunt Jane, you'll ruin your gloves. What do you expect to find? Hidden treasure?" "Not treasure, Raymond," she murmured, "but intention." Her fingers paused, closing around a small singed fragment of paper. She held it to the light, her eyes narrowing as she deciphered the faint words, "Alvarez and payment due." The rest was charred beyond reading, the edges curling like a secret reluctant to be told. She tucked the fragment into her handbag, her expression serene, but her mind racing. A burned letter, she thought, was no accident. Someone had wanted its contents destroyed, and recently, for the ashes were fresh, not settled into the dust of days. "Mrs. Bates," Miss Marple called softly, rising with Raymond's help, "you mentioned at the inquest that the fire was out when you left Mr. Grayson that evening, did you not?" The housekeeper, hovering near the door, stiffened. "Aye, it was. He didn't like a fire in the evening, said it made the room too warm." "Curious," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "These ashes seem quite recent. Perhaps Mr. Grayson lit a fire after you left." Mrs. Bates's eyes flickered, a momentary unease crossing her face. "He must have done. I wouldn't know, miss. I was gone by 6, as I said." Miss Marple nodded, her smile polite but her thoughts elsewhere. She recalled Mrs. Clement's mention of Grayson burning papers, a habit that suggested secrets he wished to erase. But these ashes, fresh and tied to Alvarez, hinted at something more urgent, a final act before his death. She thought of a case in her village where a burned diary had concealed a motive for murder, its fragments pieced together by patient hands. "Fires," she said softly to Raymond as they left the library, "are such convenient things for hiding truths. but they rarely burn everything. Outside, the air was crisp, the clouds parting to reveal patches of blue. Raymond, sensing his aunt's preoccupation, chuckled. "You're building a mystery out of cinders now, Aunt Jane? What's next? Interrogating the chimney sweep?" She smiled, adjusting her shawl. "Not the sweep, Raymond, but perhaps the one who lit the fire. Someone was in this room after Mrs. Bates left, and I doubt it was Mr. Grayson alone." Her mind turned to Eleanor, seen lurking by the library window the night before his death, despite her claim of absence. Had she entered the room, seen the letter and burned it? Or was Mrs. Bates's testimony less reliable than it seemed? As they walked back to the cottage, Miss Marple's thoughts circled the fragment in her handbag. Alvarez, payment, a locked room. The words were like notes in a discordant melody, hinting at a debt that had followed Grayson from his scandal-tainted past. She recalled the typed letter from Buenos Aires, the unease it had caused him. Was it a demand, a threat, or something else? And who had ensured its answer was reduced to ashes? That evening, as she sat by the fire in Raymond's cottage, her knitting needles clicking steadily, Miss Marple pondered the web tightening around Willow Grange. "People think they can burn away their mistakes," she murmured, her eyes on the flames. "But ashes, Raymond, have a way of speaking if you listen closely." Raymond, engrossed in his manuscript, barely looked up. "You're incorrigible, Aunt Jane. Ashes and teacups. Next, you'll have the village cat as a witness." Her smile was serene, but her mind was far from idle. The clue in the ashes was a whisper of intent, a sign that someone had acted in haste to conceal a truth. Whether it was Eleanor, guarding a family secret, or Mrs. Bates, hiding her own complicity, Miss Marple knew the answer lay in the silence of that locked library, a silence that was growing louder with every step she took. Chapter 7. The Silent Confession. The drawing room of Raymond West's cottage in Chipping Norton was a cosy haven against the chill of the late afternoon, its fire crackling merrily. As Miss Jane Marple arranged a tray of tea things with her usual precision, the room, with its low beams and chintz curtains, seemed an unlikely stage for unravelling a mystery. Yet Miss Marple had chosen it deliberately for the gathering she had orchestrated. She had invited Eleanor Grayson, Mrs. Bates, and Dr. Haydock under the pretense of discussing arrangements for Harold Grayson's memorial. But her true purpose was far less sentimental. The fragments of the puzzle, the typed letter, the burned paper, Eleanor's lie, the locked library, had begun to form a pattern, and Miss Marple intended to test its weave. Raymond, watching his aunt fuss over the teacups, raised an eyebrow. "You're playing the kindly old lady a bit too well, Aunt Jane. What's this really about? You've got that look, the one that means trouble for someone." Miss Marple's smile was serene. "Only a little conversation, Raymond. People talk so freely over tea, don't they? And sometimes they say more than they mean to." Her eyes gleamed behind her spectacles, and Raymond, recognizing the futility of arguing, settled into a corner with his notebook, content to observe. The guests arrived promptly at 4. Eleanor Grayson entered first, her face pale but composed, her dark eyes wary as she took a seat near the window. Mrs. Bates followed, her dour expression unchanged, her hands clasped tightly as if guarding against an unseen threat. Dr. Haydock, last to arrive, seemed ill at ease, his usual geniality tempered by a nervous glance at the others. Miss Marple greeted them with her customary warmth, pouring tea and offering scones with a disarming smile that belied the sharpness of her purpose. The conversation began innocently enough, with talk of the village and the upcoming memorial service. Miss Marple steered it gently, her voice soft as she mentioned Harold Grayson's solitary life. "Such a quiet man," she said, passing a cup to Eleanor. "And yet his library held so much of him. Those letters, those papers. It's strange, isn't it, how much a room can tell?" Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she took the cup, her eyes fixed on the saucer. "He was private," she said, her voice low. "I didn't know much about his affairs." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly in her lap. "Of course, my dear. Though you did visit him, didn't you? The night before he died, perhaps." Her tone was gentle, but the question hung in the air like a sudden frost. Eleanor's cup clattered against its saucer, her face draining of colour. "I told you, I hadn't been in weeks. I was in London." Mrs. Bates shifted in her chair, her lips tightening, but Miss Marple's gaze moved to her. "And you, Mrs. Bates, you left him at 6 that evening, with his tea as always. The fire was out, you said, yet there were fresh ashes in the hearth the next morning. Curious, don't you think?" The housekeeper's eyes narrowed. "I told the truth at the inquest. He must have lit it himself. I wasn't there." Dr. Haydock cleared his throat, his fingers drumming on his knee. "Miss Marple, surely you're not suggesting anything untoward. The inquest was clear. Heart failure, no signs of foul play." Miss Marple's smile was unwavering. "So it seemed, Doctor. But appearances, you know, can be deceptive. Like a locked room, which seems so final, yet tells us so little." She set her knitting aside, her voice taking on a quiet authority. "Mr. Grayson's death was no heart attack. He was poisoned, slowly, over weeks, with a substance that mimicked natural causes. The locked door was a clever touch, arranged to mislead." The room fell silent, the crackle of the fire suddenly loud. Eleanor gasped, her handkerchief twisting in her hands. Mrs. Bates's face froze, her eyes darting to the door. Dr. Haydock's hand stilled, his expression one of shock, or perhaps fear. Miss Marple continued, her tone calm but relentless. "The poison was in his tea, administered by someone he trusted. Mrs. Bates, you prepared his tea each evening, didn't you? And you knew his habits, his solitude, his secrets. You were in contact with Senor Alvarez, a man from Mr. Grayson's past, tied to that old scandal in London. The letter from Buenos Aires was a demand for payment, wasn't it? A debt he couldn't or wouldn't pay." Mrs. Bates's face crumpled, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. "You've no proof," she spat, but her voice wavered. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her words were firm. "The burned fragment in the hearth, Mrs. Bates. It bore Alvarez's name and spoke of payment. You burned it that night, after you poisoned his tea to hide your connection. And the locked door. You used a spare key, locking it after he collapsed, to make it seem he died alone." Eleanor's voice broke the silence, trembling with horror. You killed him? But why?" Mrs. Bates's defiance shattered. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. "It wasn't meant to go so far," she sobbed. "Alvarez, he wrote to me, years ago, after the scandal. Said Grayson owed him, that he'd ruined lives. He sent the poison, said it would be slow, untraceable. I only wanted the money Grayson promised me. For years of service, he never paid proper. But he kept refusing, said he'd no funds left. Alvarez, He pushed me to do it." Miss Marple turned to Eleanor, her gaze gentle but piercing. "And you, my dear, you suspected something, didn't you? That's why you were in the garden that night, by the library window. You'd seen the letters, perhaps heard your uncle's fears. You wanted to confront him, but you arrived too late." Eleanor nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I knew he was troubled, but he wouldn't tell me why. I saw the letter from Alvarez weeks ago, and he looked so afraid. I came to beg him to settle whatever it was, but the house was dark and I couldn't get in." Dr. Haydock, silent until now, spoke, his voice hoarse. "I swear, Miss Marple, I saw no signs of poison. The symptoms were consistent with heart failure." Miss Marple's smile was kind. "I don't doubt your skill, doctor, but some poisons are subtle, designed to deceive. You trusted the locked room, as we all did." She paused, her eyes returning to Mrs. Bates. "But the truth, Mrs. Bates, cannot be locked away." Mrs. Bates's confession poured out, a torrent of guilt and fear. She had slipped the poison into Grayson's tea for weeks, supplied by Alvarez, who had tracked her down as Grayson's confidant. The locked door was her final act, using a spare key to stage the scene. The police were summoned, and Mrs. Bates was taken away, her defiance reduced to broken sobs. As the room emptied, Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting resumed. Raymond, shaken, stared at her. "Aunt Jane, how did you know?" She smiled, her needles clicking. "People, Raymond, are like patterns. They repeat themselves, and the flaws always show if you look closely enough." Chapter 8. The village settles. The soft glow of dawn crept over Chipping Norton, painting the rooftops with a gentle light that seemed to wash away the shadows of the past days. The village, stirred by the scandal of Harold Grayson's death, buzzed with a mixture of awe and relief, its gossip now fueled by the arrest of Mrs. Bates. The cobblestone streets echoed with whispers, and the village, green, usually a place of quiet exchanges, hummed with animated voices, recounting the housekeeper's tearful confession. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the window of Raymond West's cottage, watched the scene with her usual calm, her knitting needles moving steadily as she worked on the final rows of her pink shawl. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and early autumn leaves, and the village seemed to exhale, as if freed from a weight it had not known it bore. Raymond, still reeling from the events of the previous afternoon, paced the small sitting room, his writer's imagination grappling with the reality of his aunt's deductions. "You've outdone yourself, Aunt Jane," he said, pausing to pour a cup of tea. "Poison, a spare key, a South American creditor. It's like one of my novels, only you've made it real. How do you do it, picking up these threads no one else sees?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles, but her voice was modest. "It's only observation, Raymond, and a little understanding of human nature. People are not so different wherever you go. They carry their fears and their greed, and those things leave traces, like footprints in a garden." She paused, her needles clicking softly. Mr. Grayson's library was silent, but it spoke volumes if you knew how to listen. The village had begun to settle into its routine, though the ripples of the case lingered. Eleanor Grayson, pale but resolute, had returned to Willow Grange to sort through her uncle's affairs. Miss Marple, meeting her briefly at the church, noted the young woman's quiet strength, tempered by a lingering sadness. "I should have pressed him harder," Eleanor confided, her voice low as they stood by the lich gate. I knew he was troubled, but I thought it was just his past, not this." She gestured vaguely, as if the weight of her uncle's death could not be named. Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on her arm. "You did what you could, my dear. Some secrets are buried too deep for families to unearth, but you'll move forward, I'm sure." Eleanor nodded, her eyes distant. "I'm selling Willow Grange. It's too full of ghosts. I'll return to London, start fresh." Her voice held a note of resolve, and Miss Marple, with a nod, let her go, knowing that time would mend what guilt could not. At the cottage, Clara, the housemaid, brought news of the village's reaction. "They're all talking, miss," she said, setting down a tray of biscuits. "Mrs. Lavender says Mrs. Bates was always sly, but no one thought her a murderer. And Mr. Phipps, the butcher, reckons Senor Alvarez must be some foreign villain, like in a film." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Villains, Clara, are rarely so theatrical. More often, they're ordinary folk, driven by ordinary wants. Money, revenge, security." She thought of Mrs. Bates, whose resentment of unpaid wages had festered under Alvarez's influence, turning her loyalty into betrayal. The police had sent inquiries to Buenos Aires, seeking Alvarez, but Miss Marple suspected he was a shadow, too cunning to be easily caught. Her concern, however, was Chipping Norton, where the truth had been laid bare. Raymond, settling into an armchair, shook his head. "You make it sound so simple, Aunt Jane. But that locked room, the poison, how did you piece it together? I'd have wagered on Eleanor, or even Dr. Haydock, before suspecting the housekeeper." Miss Marple's needles paused as she considered her answer. "It was the ashes, Raymond, that told the story. A fire lit after Mrs. Bates claimed to have left. A burned letter mentioning Alvarez. It pointed to someone close, someone with access. Mrs. Bates's resentment was there in her manner, her sharp words at the inquest. And Eleanor's lie about not visiting, though suspicious, was the fear of a niece who sensed trouble but didn't understand it. Dr. Haydock, poor man, was merely deceived by a clever poison, as doctors sometimes are. She recalled a case in her own village, where a housekeeper's quiet grudge had led to a theft, overlooked because she seemed so indispensable. People trust those who serve them, she added, but trust can blind. Mrs. Bates knew Mr. Grayson's habits, his tea, his solitude. She was the perfect tool for Alvarez's revenge. As the day wore on, Miss Marple packed her knitting bag, preparing for the journey back to her own village. Raymond, helping her with her case, grumbled good-naturedly. "You've turned Chipping Norton upside down, Aunt Jane. They'll be talking about you for years," she chuckled, adjusting her hat in the mirror. "Let them talk, Raymond. A village needs its stories, and I'm happy to fade into theirs." But as they boarded the train, the countryside rolling past in a blur of green and gold, Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on Willow Grange. The locked library, the burned letter, the poisoned tea, they were reminders that silence was never empty. It held motives, fears, and truths, waiting for someone to hear them. "People think they can hide in silence," she said softly, her eyes on the passing fields. "But silence, Raymond, is the loudest confession of all." Raymond, half dozing, murmured, "You're impossible, Aunt Jane." But he smiled, knowing his aunt had once again seen what others missed. And as the train carried them away, Chipping Norton settled back into its quiet rhythm, its secrets laid bare by the unassuming spinster whose sharp mind had heard the truth in its silence.